Have you ever experienced a moment that was just so traumatic, it unraveled everything that you thought you knew about yourself? A devastation of what you thought you knew of the world, even your own character, what you believe to be true and what you believe in. Moments like that can go one of two ways. One is a pretty dark path that can sometimes be so bad, it can end up leading you to cause a similar moment for not only yourself, but for others. The alternate path is a path of healing and working towards a better way of being, reshaping your view of the world, even your views about what your purpose in life is. My guest this week has been through all of what I've described. Dean Yates was the bureau chief of the Reuters news agency in Baghdad during the worst of the Iraq War. And on the 12th of July, 2007, Dean experienced a moment that changed his life irrevocably. Something that dragged him through the very blackest heart of humanity. And he very nearly didn't come back. But with a lot of work and a lot of support, he got about the business of really getting better. And now Dean works as a mental health advocate, committing his time to help organisations with their mental health strategy and training. Today on the show, you're going to hear Dean share a very raw and very gritty account of his 7-year odyssey to find the best ways to treat his PTSD, how to deal with moral injury, and how to reconnect with his family. The book that Dean has written is fairly brilliant. It's called A Line in the Sand. If you've ever been through something quite traumatic, you'll read a lot of your own experience in what he has to say. And I hope this chat today will give you a window into someone in your life who's been through something like that, perhaps. But if it's you, just, I guess, observe what acceptance and action can do, how powerful these two things combined can be, even when you're faced with some of the most overwhelming and dangerous situations imaginable. Enjoy this chat with Dean Yates. Dean, thank you so much for joining me. We are 56 minutes after I told you I'd be here.
It's all right. Don't worry about it. I'll show it happens.
Do you want to know? You want to know why?
Go for it.
So I had to see my doctor because there's some goo in my throat. And it's been a week, and I'm like, all right, I should probably go. Go. And I sit down, and we start having chats, and he takes my blood pressure, and some of the medication I'm on makes my blood pressure a bit high. And he goes, okay, well, I'll just take you through some relaxations, see if we can't get that down a bit. And next thing I know, he hypnotized me. And I'm sure you've had this one where they put your arm in the air and all that bizzo, and not like cluck like a chicken Peter Power stuff, but in a clinical sense. It was in a medical clinic. I've worked with GPs and psychologists who've done it before. And it's been a long time since I've done that sort of thing. And if people have jumped on stage at Twin Towns and clucked like a chicken, then afterwards when they're interviewed going, I don't know why I clucked like a chicken. I knew what I was doing. The whole time it was happening, Dean's waiting. Dean's waiting on a call. Dean's waiting on a call. And I'm just feeling my blood pressure just plummet and my heart rate drop. And so it was interesting because I'm trying to be as relaxed as I possibly can be, but also at the same time really aware that I come and get you, but at the same time we're going, gee, it'd be interesting to talk to you about this.
Does hypnotization, I have never done hypnotization. I've done a lot of stuff, sweat lodges, EMDR, meds, psych wards, you name it, I've done most of it. Hypnotization, no.
Hypnotizing is, how do I put this? It's kind of like a super-powered mindfulness hack. And it turns on, in the same way that a polyvagal breath can turn on your relaxation response, right? It's kind of hacking that kind of, he was doing things where he was kind of tugging my arm in a particular way and just taking advantage of some of the tension response and then relaxation parts of holding an arm in the air and then letting it go and using that as a trigger point. Very fascinating stuff. And I think he was just doing this part to prove a point. And at one point he says, okay, in a minute you're going to stand up and you're going to stretch, but you won't be able to move your right arm. And in my head I'm like, oh, fuck you, pal. Sure enough. Okay.
All right.
That's really interesting. I'm on meds and I have to pee all the time because of all the water I have to drink because of how thirsty they make me. But
I'll try everything. And if there's evidence behind it, and the evidence around hypnosis and certainly that kind of clinical hypnosis stuff is really good. And I've had great success with it before. And that's just the first time in ages I've had a chat, because I just haven't, I guess I've been in so much trouble in my life. Like I haven't had time of like, okay, I appreciate that you're doing that over there, but I'm over here on antipsychotics. So good luck, but they're not going to touch the sides.
Well, I know all about the trouble you've been in.
You're holding up.
So I've read your book.
You're holding up my book. That's very sweet of you, mate.
You know, and the reason I came across your book was, and this is probably a few years ago now, was that I was trying to find books written by men.
Yeah.
Memoirs written by men who'd been through mental health struggles, and frankly, there's not a lot out there.
Not enough.
And someone, I don't know who recommended I buy this, or I probably found it by doing an internet search.
Yeah, right.
You know, men, memoirs, mental health. And I just thought it was a fantastic book. I just thought your honesty, your vulnerability, and the fact Audrey gets a voice at the end. I just thought that was fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Really, really great stuff. So
thanks,
I know you're supposed to be interviewing me.
No. But it's a big part.
I'm an old journo, so well done.
No, it's okay, Dean, because it's a big part of it, isn't that you can't be what you can't see. And I started this podcast because the kind of conversations I was hearing in recovery, the kind of conversations which identified where people were, what they had done and where they were now, so that people who were in that tough spot could hear, there's something else other than this. Because in those tough spots, our brains do this thing that, and this is how people get into a lot of trouble, and I very nearly got into a lot of trouble. I was lucky to get out of it. Our brains go, and this is how it's going to be forever. And that's not real. It's a survival thing that our brain does. And it's important to hear those stories. And so that's why I started this show, and that's why I wrote that book, because, if you don't know that there's another thing to do besides the thing your brain is screaming at you to do 20 times a day, you may go, well, that's the only idea I've got. So it's what I'm going to go, and, it doesn't have to be that way.
No. And I think men of our generation have got to get a message out there to men.
Oh, yeah.
That you've got to get help. And you got to be open about it. You got to talk to your partners about it. I mean, our natural response is to just isolate ourselves and say nothing.
Yeah. Well, and I know you do speak about this, and that culturally, there's not many communities around the world where culturally it's okay, or has been okay, for a person to hold on to their admired masculinity and their ability to go, I'm not quite thinking straight, give me a minute, at the same time. And it's not often that, it's starting to happen, I think. It's starting to happen more and more. And I think it's happened for a long time, but people just never really spoke about it because of how much stigma's around it. And to be honest, and I'm, as you've read, but I'll say it out loud, it was the self-stigma that stopped me getting and taking. I was offered meds 7 years before I started taking them. I wasted nearly a decade, and got way sicker, way further down the fucking hole than I had to go. I didn't have to get that sick.
Oh yeah, my first admission to the psych ward, I'm actually telling the nurses I don't want to take Valium because that would be a sign of weakness, and I'm in a psych ward.
Amazing. So your former gig. You work in the mental health space now, which I'm very happy to, talk, very happy to know. And you work in, delivering programs of mental health, fitness and things like this, and resilience and stuff, and looking after yourself, particularly how to be a journalist and look after yourself.
Yes.
Which is bloody important. That's what you do now, but previously you were the head of mental health and well-being strategy at Reuters. This is nearly 20 years ago.
Well, I was actually the head of mental health at Reuters. That was the last job I had with Reuters. I was there for 26 years. Most of it, I was a journalist, bureau chief, senior editor, most of it overseas.
All right. So low stakes environments and reporting on shit that's like pretty much benign.
Yeah, Bali bombings, Boxing Day tsunami, the Iraq War. I covered earthquakes that killed 1,000 people that no one would even remember.
Far out, man. And, you'd speak to journalism students now, and like I read the news I have to be careful about it because I had a problem with it. I read the news now in one sitting in the day, and that's it. Journalism is kind of like a job, a little like a first responder, in that we're paying you to be on the front line, to deal with the really grim stuff that we as a community know that we'll get damaged by if we hear that every single day. But we'd still need to know about it. Now, I've said this before, I said I did a conference with a bunch of ambulance drivers, and I said, because I knew this because both my parents were doctors, right? First responding, be it a fire, police, or ambulance, like not getting PTSD is a part of your job description. Like you have to actively try to not get PTSD, but for forever. That is not anywhere near the training or within the debriefing. With journalism, fucking forget about it. Like military people get rotated out of war zones. Journalists just stay. And I've had people on the show who have at times been fucking broken by it. And like, do people just like gallop into it wanting to be, Hunter S. and Grenada? Like, do people have an idea that they might get damaged by this job?
I think, look, if you go back to when I started out, so we're talking 30 years ago, in my case, I wanted to bear witness to history.
Yeah.
I decided to become a journalist after I climbed the Berlin Wall. So you go back to that era, right? That was pretty significant. That was a pretty significant moment in history.
Did you high-five Hasselhoff?
I didn't see him there.
He was there.
But, right, okay, I missed him. And so for me, it was all about wanting to witness history, try to interpret what was happening in the world, make sense of events.
Yeah.
And it was that adventure. And I was also inspired by people like Neil Davis, who was a legendary Tasmanian war cameraman who covered the Vietnam War. But some journalists get into it because they have this great sense of justice, and they want to expose the injustices in the world. And so they also expose themselves to great risk, be it from the suffering of the stories they cover, the people that they cover, or the risk that they incur from those people who don't want them to do those stories. And you're absolutely right, Osher. The journalists are first responders in many respects, and it's only relatively recently that the industry has realized that there is a mental toll on the work that journalists do. It's only been 20 years since the first research was actually published on how war correspondents are at risk of developing PTSD. Only 20 years. And it's only now that media organizations are starting to understand that journalists who work with distressing material in their newsrooms, and these are often young journalists monitoring social media, taking footage from the war in Ukraine, that they are at risk as well, having to take all this material in, then work it, edit it, turn it into a package. Their brain doesn't distinguish between whether they are in the field or out or in their comfortable newsroom. It's trauma.
Oh my God. Have you seen that? You probably have. There's a supercut of a war correspondent's first day in the Ukraine, and she's there in the flak jacket with her helmet and everything, and it's about just 2 straight minutes of her just flinching at explosion sounds. And I think the cameraman put it together. And it's an unbelievable document, essentially, of, well, in 6 months, she'll be standing there like her producer, not caring. But is that a good thing?
No. And look, I get upset because media organizations are not looking after the mental health of their staff, whether they're the correspondents they're sending to Ukraine or whether these are young journalists who are editing distressing material.
Yeah.
And it's not just the wars. I've had young journalists reach out to me and say, I'm getting distressed editing footage of the natural disasters happening in Australia, the flooding, for example, telling me they're having nightmares about editing this stuff. They don't understand why they are upset by it, but they know it's affecting them.
Yeah. And the idea that, we put handrails on balconies at the workplace.
Yep.
The mezzanine is not just a floor. There's a wall or a railing there.
Yep.
There's a cutoff switch on the kettle. There's a non-slip thing on the stairwell. We want to make sure that people are physically safe at their work. But some jobs, and I would argue that journalism is getting more dangerous because the market pressure is for more and more immersive reporting and more intense footage.
I actually think it's harder today than at any time in history to be a journalist, because it's not just what we've just been talking about, the trauma, the exposure. It's the online abuse, the online violence that occurs. And then it's the precariousness of the industry, the sheer nature of how easy it is for journalists to just lose their jobs, and that 24/7 hyper-connected, switched-on world. It's really tough
to have. I mean, just look, both Lee Sales and Stan Grant had to go, you know what? I can't keep going. Can't keep going. Like, these are, like, I don't care what you think. Like, these are two people who are they are the Usain Bolt of what they do for a job.
They're tough.
Doesn't matter which lens, like, if they worked for, you know, a gigantic kind of red-bannered media organization or they worked for someone else, the skill set of what they do is unbelievable. The way that each of them can slow-mo, just like take apart a response and put together something else and then bang, like hold power to account. And they both can't. They're both like, nope, I've got to move away from that.
Yep.
It's such a sad thing for all of us because we no longer get that kind of interrogation at that level. And I would like to say that there's going to be more stuff done around that, but I don't know, man. Like, we got to have news. We can't not have news. We need news.
And it's more important than ever that we have accurate news.
Yeah.
That we have news that people can trust, and that young people especially. I get really worried about where young people are getting their news from.
Well, it's got two words and it's got a lot of T's and not a lot of other vowels.
Right.
There's a couple of K sounds in there.
I'm not on it.
There's a couple of K sounds in there. And, you know, if doesn't matter whatever you say, if it's right or wrong, if you have 50,000 other people have seen it, then as far as everyone else is concerned, yes. The validation of the volume is a really interesting thing that we're dealing with in our community now, you know, and, you know, that we have, as we speak, by the time we put this out, that'll probably be even more so, like the ability to have a point of view robustly supported at scale because you can use large language models to produce just gigatons of content, which will then game the search engines and the algorithms of this is how much volume is coming in about this particular point of view. So therefore, this must be what's happening. It isn't. But that's a real risk that we face moving forward, you know, as far as holding on to you know, objective view of reality. And as someone who's lost that from time to time, that's terrifying for me.
Yeah.
It's pretty scary, Dean.
Totally. I agree. I agree.
You write and very generously you write about what happened to you when you were in the Middle East, because you write really beautifully about a thing called a moral injury. And it's not dissimilar from PTSD, but it is not the same thing. I'd love it if we could just kind of talk a bit about a moral injury, and then in that context, kind of, if you wouldn't mind taking us through what happened to you.
Sure. Yeah, look, thanks for bringing up moral injury, Osher. This is the thing that people are really finding fascinating about my experiences in the book. It's really grabbing people's attention, and I'm really pleased about that. You know, moral injury it's when someone's sense of what's right has been violated strongly enough, they can suffer what's called a moral injury. And as you say, it's similar to PTSD, has a lot of the similar symptoms and similar psychological ramifications as well.
Such as?
In suicide. A lot of the intrusive symptoms, the depression, the self-loathing. In particular, moral injury, its signature symptoms are guilt and shame, which makes sense, right? Because if you have, if something has happened to you or you've done something that is on a moral dimension, guilt and shame are going to figure prominently. Whereas PTSD is often seen more as a fear or a life threat condition. Moral injury is more something where an action has occurred that you have committed or someone has committed against you, or you've witnessed something that you feel is just morally wrong. And so I guess in the case of myself, I was the bureau chief for Reuters in Baghdad in 2007 when 2 of my staff were killed in an attack by a US gunship on July 12, 2007, in an attack that was made famous when Julian Assange released footage of this a few years later that showed this horrible incident where about a dozen people were killed, including my photographer and a driver, and he called that tape collateral murder, and it's essentially become the most controversial footage in the history of war. For me, the moral injury was that I failed to protect my staff, and then when that tape came out, I failed to speak up and tell the story of what happened on that day. I didn't realize I was traumatized by this at the time, and I couldn't speak. I could literally not speak, but I didn't at the time, and I didn't try to force Reuters to call for an independent investigation into what happened. And as a result, what happened was that no one challenged, apart from WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, no one really challenged the US military line on how my staff were killed. That was another aspect of my moral injury. Now, people will say it's war, it's the fog of war, these things happen. But here's the thing about moral injury. People need to be given room to be able to judge their actions based on what happened, and to be able to, what you should have done, what you could have done. And that's one of the things I like about moral injury, is because it does allow people that opportunity to be able to assess themselves and say, I didn't live up to the standards I set for myself.
Because that's the other part of moral injury is you've written it's the betrayal of what's right by someone who holds authority.
Correct.
In a high stakes situation. Is it okay with you if we talk a little bit about the footage? Because
yeah, no, absolutely. I've spoken about this a lot.
Okay. I'm just really
completely fine.
I didn't want to kind of go back on
no
it,
worries.
so I'm just asking. And if there's anything we speak about that you go,
sure.
I don't want that in, you just tell me straight away.
Yeah.
You know what? It's here. Is it here? Is it in my? Yeah. So every time I pick this up, this is my Canon 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Every single time it's
very similar to what Namir had that day when he was
exactly. This is
I think it was almost the same.
It is. Is
it really? Okay.
Slung over his shoulder, and so it has no lens cap on it, so it appears like it's a big black kind of hole.
Yeah.
Right. And you hear the chopper pilot scream RPG, and that's it.
Yep.
And I knew it was a fucking camera. I can see it. I can see the outline. And there's another part of that footage which is it's afterwards. It's when the white van shows up.
Yeah.
And you can hear one of the guys on the radio saying, you shouldn't bring a fucking kid to a war zone.
Yeah.
And then they hit go. And I just, I don't like to think about it often, and I'm sure you don't either, but just even to speak about it right now, it's just like, I cannot fucking imagine what it would be to have that happen to people I worked with, but then to see that and hear the callousness of the tones of voice and the complete dehumanization of the people on the ground. And then when the footage comes out, it's like, bro, here's some pretty strong, like someone's fucked up and it wasn't the guy standing there. And then what happens? Like the betrayal, as you wrote, the betrayal of what's right is so evident.
Yeah, that attack on the van was a war crime. International legal experts from around the world were very clear that was a war crime. And I think this is what really upsets me about Julian Assange and his continued incarceration, is that he showed what the war in Iraq really looked like. His actions, his bravery in publishing this tape, knowing full well what was going to happen, he has kept the names of my staff alive forever and shown the world what the war in Iraq really looked like, and that war crimes were committed, and yet no one was ever charged over that attack. No one was ever held accountable, and yet it's Julian Assange who is the one paying the price right now still for his bravery in publishing that tape.
You brought up in Australia, you kind of live in this world here at least where, there's authority figures, and for the most part, Queensland Police in the 80s aside, they're mostly trustable.
Yes.
And you kind of have this structure of, as you grow up to be an adult, you're like, well, humans are human, and there's going to be corruption, and there's going to be poor choices in many systems, and that's a factor of giant systems, is that they have a flaw, and that there's people in them, and people are flawed. You try to put checks and safeguards in there, in the forms as we have of law and consequence for stuff. But to have this gigantic authority such as the US. Just you were in the Middle East, you're bureau chief, you're seeing what's happening to the country. You're seeing the reason why they went in versus what was actually going on. It wouldn't have happened overnight. What were your first kind of signs that, was there a fracturing of how, you kind of saw the world? What was the kind of moments where things started to fall to bits?
It's a good question, Osher. It's a really good question. I think for me, one of the things about covering the war in Iraq was you're so damn busy. The violence was off the charts. Suicide bombs every day.
Yeah.
It made the war in Syria look like a picnic. And I know that sounds terrible to say, but it really was horrendous. And so we were just sometimes trying to just keep up with the story. But I think when I got back to us, when I left Iraq at the end of 2008, I was then transferred to Singapore, the Reuters Asia headquarters. And it was literally, I think, when the tape was released in 2010, and I realized then that the military had basically fucked us by not giving us the tape. Reuters lawyers had been seeking that tape for a few years. I think I just realized then that everything that the US military had told us and said to us was a complete lie. And I don't know, maybe it was a bit of naivety on my part to even think that it would have been anything otherwise. But there was still a part of me that was maybe held on to this idea that when people are killed, people will do the right thing. And that never happened. So that was the lifting of the veil, if you like, when that tape came out, and everything changed for me.
Yeah, so I'm imagining the rope stopped being so, there starts to get a fair bit of slack in the rope. And, as you go, as far as your connection to, how things have been working in the world, and the world work starts to slack off. Were you finding that you were trying to reconnect? Were you people can drink or use as a way to try to get back on track?
Yeah, I was never much of a drinker, to be honest. It was more work. Work was one of my escapes.
Yeah,
sure. Here's the strange thing. I was getting the top performance rating every year, even though I was getting deeper and deeper into PTSD.
Yeah, right.
Without sort of realizing it. I was running the top stories for Reuters in Asia, and I'd be gone before my family. I would have left home in Singapore before my family were even awake, and then I'd be doing news meetings at night, and yet I would have to wear earmuffs if there were thunderstorms because of the noise. My noise sensitivity was off the charts.
Oh, wow.
Right. The signs were already there. This is before we even moved back to Australia 10 years ago. The signs were already there, but yet I could do my job really, really well.
It's a problem. Like high functioning is kind of a two-handed thing, I was lucky. Similarly, I was able to kind of keep going because, to be honest, like the focus of the work was something that was actually quite important to help me go forward. But then it was like, well, you can't be that bad showing up here, in my brain, whatever. Did you mentioned you're with your family and I'm assuming they were a bit more little than they are now.
Yeah.
Usually that's a bit of a sign, when, your partner usually says, hey, buddy. Was there denial? Was there friction?
Massive denial. And here's the thing, right? So my wife, Mary, she is a former journalist. So she was a journalist for 20 years. Started out at the ABC down in Hobart, worked for Reuters Television in Asia for a number of years. She worked with cameramen who have PTSD. So she knew the signs, and she tried to convince me that I had a problem for a long time. But I just refused to believe that anything was wrong. And part of it was because I could still do my job, I think. That was part of it. The other part of it was that after what I'd gone through my work, I thought I'm indestructible. And the third part of it was toxic masculinity, right? I just thought, I love my wife and I admire her immensely. She's been an inspiration to me, but I thought, when it comes to my mental health, no, you're wrong about that. And I just didn't listen. And that stopped me from getting help for years. I could have gotten help so much earlier if I had have listened to Mary. Yeah. And it was only when I was literally, one day in early 2016, she begged me to get help, because by then I was just really... I was impossible to be around. I had all the PTSD signs, the noise sensitivity, the agitation, the depression. Some mornings I couldn't get out of bed. The kids then didn't know. They were aged, 13, 14, 15. They just were utterly confused and worried. And
wow.
And I got diagnosed in 45 minutes.
That's the thing. A lot of people may, not talk about mental health. When they talk about mental health, they may not understand that. And, I'm sure you've worked real hard on it since, but for every one person that is dealing with a mental health issue, there's 5 people essentially that are also affected.
Yeah, it's like a cluster bomb. That's how I describe it. It's like a cluster bomb going off in a house. Everyone is affected. And this is why when I give talks and speak to people, I say, and especially to men, you've got to listen to your loved ones. If they say that something's not quite right, you've got to listen. And it's no great burden to go and see a professional. There's waiting lists and all that sort of shit. I'm fully aware of how difficult it is these days to get help. But sometimes just acknowledging that you might have an issue is a start.
It is. And as I like to say, there's one thing to know where the fire escape in the hotel room is. And you're never going to know it if you don't look at the little, thing on the back of your door. But, it's another thing altogether to know what fire is.
Sure. No, totally.
Like, how am I not, I don't understand why I'm suddenly not able to breathe very well and I'm getting very hot. What's going on? You kind of, it's one thing to know that it's a problem. But to understand that it's not going to go away and it's certainly not going to get better. In fact, odds on it's going to get way worse and take down way more people than just you badly if you don't sort it out. It's the real trick, because the safe thing to do is to go to ground. The safe thing to do is to try to, retreat,
Yeah.
And it's really, really tough, man. It's so... You mentioned cameramen before. I've worked with a camo who's done some pretty gnarly stuff filming in Southeast Asia in the 80s and 90s. And, I know that, Art Chair is one of the places that you've done work around. And boy, it's one thing to think about whiteys going in and out of there, but it's another thing about people live there. That's their home. That's they can't come back here. Yeah. They don't have a Medicare card.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I know some journalists. So in my book, I write about a BBC correspondent who, for her, one of the worst things was actually getting treatment for her trauma, knowing that the population of Iraq was traumatized and that they would never get treatment. It's being a journalist carries a lot of baggage.
Man, sorry. You just watched me. Sorry. I I like scuba diving, and I've had the bends, and I found myself in the emergency ward at Denpasar Hospital.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And
when was this?
2015.
Okay.
And the brown wing built by Japan, and
Yep.
I sat there, and it was fucking packed. Like, there was maybe 6 beds, and there might have been 48 people in there. All right. And I sat there. I was on a work trip, and one of the people I was working with was next to me, and I watched 2 people die in front of me in the space of 10 minutes.
Wow.
Because there's no fucking medical system. They show up when people are like, they're doing the breathing, right? If you've heard someone towards the end of life, they do this breath. And so these 2, they were, opening the curtains, going to get a bag, coming back, and my phone rang, and it was the local, I think it was the local fixer. No, it was a fixer back in Sydney, going, "What the fuck are you doing there? Like, here's the number, blah, 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 blah." I made a phone call. We got in a taxi 3.5 kilometres north from us. Mate, I am by myself in this gigantic room with a, beautiful kind of, I think she was German nurse, giving me oxygen treatment, like spick and span, completely pristine room, and I'm lying there getting this 5-star hotel treatment going.
Was it the SOS clinic?
I can't remember. It was blue.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, this is fucking fucked.
Yeah.
There's people dying 3,000 meters from me, and I'm only here because my work paid for an insurance thing that gets me here. This is fucking terrible.
Yeah.
It was awful. Man, I get that. Sorry, that was a long story to explain why my head bowed when you talked about your colleague.
And look, this is part of the moral dimension.
Yeah.
Of the work that journalists do, is telling the stories of people in these countries and going through these sorts of events, and then being able to then look after themselves in a way where they don't actually feel guilty about it.
Yeah.
Right. Realizing that if you want to do your job, you've actually got to look after yourself, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to do your job, and then you're no use to anyone.
Is this the kind of stuff you talk to journalism students about?
Yes. And journalists. I mean, look, it's about, people say to me, "What did you do? What would you have done differently in my career?" And I say, I probably wouldn't have gone from Jerusalem to Baghdad. That was probably a mistake.
That's a tricky stamp on your passport.
Yeah. But seriously, going from Jerusalem to Baghdad probably wasn't a good idea. But the story was just, there was so much happening. The 2000s, and it was just all happening. So I wanted to be there. But
yeah.
And then maybe after Baghdad, I should have taken 6 months off. I took 6 weeks off.
Yeah, right.
Mistake. These are the sorts of things I talk about. I think journalists can cover these sorts of stories, these sorts of events for their entire lives if they look after themselves. You're going to get traumatized. It's going to happen. But if you look after yourself and you have the support of your bosses, which is always a big factor, then you can do it for as long as you want to. But broken journalists don't write good stories. They don't produce good shows. It's just not possible.
Right. And that's ultimately a factor. I'm sure, as the business of selling the news, it's not telling the news anymore, sadly. As the business of selling the news gets, more and more tricky, quality is the thing that you're going to.
Yeah. I've seen it. I've seen it in so many journos who just can't do their job the way they used to because they are mentally impaired.
You've had some pretty high stakes gigs, man. When you stride in the front door as bureau chief in Baghdad, I often like to think about that. We always get, I think it's not the Peter principle, it's something else. Our next job is just a little beyond our coping strategies that have got us where we are, but we kind of figure it out. We got to where we got to, and we then push the next bit and go, whoa, and the day-to-day is now what we used to floor you for a week. How quickly did you realize that, oh boy, this is a different speed?
2 things. So I came from Jerusalem, right? So I was already
What year, Jerusalem?
2006, the war was
right,
on.
So it's all on, man.
So that was, that was pretty hectic.
Yeah.
But then going into Baghdad, was a whole different scenario. The country was in civil war, basically. There were 150,000 American troops there, hunkering down in their bases, really not being able to do anything, not trying to do anything. The US at the time was just clueless as to what to do. They'd yet to implement this thing called the surge, right? They hadn't yet had this last roll of the dice. So
Forgive me, Dean, would you describe it as a quagmire? Sorry, I fucking have to.
Oh no, it was a quagmire. This was Vietnam
like,
Mark II.
That footage of Cheney going, don't do it, it's a fucking quagmire.
This was Vietnam in the desert. And I'll debate anyone who wants to argue otherwise. But so I arrive in Baghdad at the start of 2007, and these security guys pick me up. They're ex-Royal Ulster Constabulary, Irish guys, right? Ex-Royal Marines. These guys have seen everything. Yeah. And they tell me the road to the office into central Baghdad has gotten worse, more dangerous since I was there last time, which was in 2004. Yeah. And they say to me, look, if we get immobilized or whatever, one of us will just carjack another car and do whatever we have to and get you to the office. That's what we'll do. And I'm like, okay. And so that was the first thing. What I'd gone into that bureau, my first directive from the editor-in-chief of Reuters was to draw up a contingency plan to evacuate the entire bureau. We were worried about getting overrun by insurgents.
Mate, when I first started in radio, my early program directors would say to me, before you open the mic, before you start a talk break, know how you're getting out before you're getting in. And for me, that was always like, it's what I tell anyone about being on TV is like, just know what you're throwing to, know how you're getting out. And you just described it like, well, I guess that goes to a pretty solid conclusion, doesn't it?
It was a reality check. But the thing was, they didn't tell me this until after I'd gotten the job. I'd already accepted the job. And then they said, by the way, can you draw up a contingency plan to evacuate the bureau and cover the story from Amman and Dubai and Iraqi Kurdistan? And I'm like, what the fuck have I got myself into?
I'm never going to be the bureau chief. And most people listening are never going to be a bureau chief, certainly not in a war zone. But all of us will have a moment where we go, look, if it gets to that point, we're going to no longer do this thing that we've committed to. What did you do? Like, part of this plan would have been a couple of trigger points. Like, if this starts to happen, we all pack our bags and get them on the ground and get ready to go. And if a couple of days later the power goes out, well, then we're going to have, what for you, like when you're putting those kind of things together, those trigger points where you go, there's no coming back from here. If this happens, we're out. Yeah.
Well, it was any word, any suspicion that our compound was going to get raided. Right. That was the trigger point. And when I say compound, we were in the red zone. So we weren't in the green zone, the sort of supposedly safe and secure part where the American embassy was and the military headquarters. We had a compound, a blast-walled compound with the New York Times, the Associated Press, and the BBC near the Tigris River. And we're all in there together, all surrounded by blast walls and stuff. We had Iraqi guards at one end of the street with AK-47s at another end of the street. And the French embassy was also in our compound, and they had special forces in there. So we sort of knew that we had a relatively, but we never knew if the French would ever come to our aid, because the French are the French, right?
Yeah, they've also got their own people to look after in there.
Yeah, that's right. So the view was, and if there was a raid, we're going. If there was, we're going. And if we got word that there was going to be a raid, we're out of there.
Yeah, right.
That was going to be the trigger point.
My goodness,
because the insurgents weren't taking prisoners; they were just killing people, and they were just massacring people, especially foreigners.
Jesus, man! Like, is there laughter? Is there joy?
Well, what we try and do is, we had about 100 people. Reuters employed about 100 people across Iraq. We were basically the biggest foreign media organization there. When it was quiet, which wasn't often, we'd gather in the yard. We had a nice big yard. And if the generator was mercifully off, like if power was actually on, we'd sit around and drink beers. I mean, Muslim country, but most of the guys drank. And there was a tradition in Baghdad of cooking fish in the ground. So a couple of the guys would dig a hole in the ground and they'd stick fish in the ground and with some charcoal and heat it that way and cover up with foil and stuff, and we'd sit around and talk and whatnot. But every single member of that bureau had lost a loved one to the war, friends. I'd have someone come into my office and say, "Oh, my brother-in-law's just been kidnapped by insurgents. Can you help with ransom money?" That sort of thing. It was just happening all the time. By the time the US left Iraq in 2011, Reuters had lost 10 people,
Jesus,
either directly or indirectly as a result of the war.
And people may be aware, but they may not be aware. Journalism's generally like the Red Cross. It's a big no-no.
Journalists have increasingly been targeted in war zones, but Iraq changed that equation in a way that journalists had never been targeted before. Journalists were sought out in Iraq and seen as ideal targets, seen as ideal kidnapping targets. I mean, put it this way: we had these big blue flak jackets with press written across them. Don't wear them. Seriously. Because you're putting a target on you if you do.
Wow.
So while all the foreign media organizations had shipped in all these big blue flak jackets with press, everyone wore these little black ones that you could fit under your T-shirt. At one point, it just got too dangerous for a lot of foreigners to even go out on the streets. I mean, some very courageous photographers did and still were taking pictures, but oh my goodness, it was dangerous. And the thing for me was, with my PTSD, what really did it for me was fear. Yeah. And I only discovered this a few years ago because after all the therapy I went through and all the thinking about my trauma, but I realized only a few years ago that the reason for my noise sensitivity was fear of being kidnapped.
Oh my gosh.
Fear of being kidnapped. For all 700 days and nights I spent in Iraq, there was always that fear of getting kidnapped. We all felt it.
Yeah.
Because if you did, you're going to end up dead.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst nightmare that I used to have was insurgents chasing me in my sleep through the streets of Baghdad, and I didn't know how to get back to the office.
Oh, man. These things are kind of following you, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have these nightmares much anymore. Very rarely, in fact. But that's because I went through a process. When I realized that I had this fear was locked in my body. When I realized that this fear was locked in my body, and I didn't understand it, but once I did, then I went through a process of EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, to deal with that fear. And I remember speaking to my psychologist in Launceston, and I said, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard of EMDR. It became famous because Prince Harry used it and so on. And
oh man, fuck Prince Harry. I was doing EMDR in 94, 93.
Were you really?
Man. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I got really lucky. I got picked up by the state mental health system.
That is amazing.
Yeah, I got really lucky.
You must have been one of the first people in Australia.
There you go.
Who? Wow.
In an outpatient psych facility in Brisbane.
Did it work for you?
I can't remember. Maybe, I guess. I got a lot better quite quickly.
Yeah, right.
I guess it did.
That's the thing. That is the thing, right? So the way it worked for me was, my psychologist said, let's go to some moments where you really were afraid. And so she got me to describe some situations where I thought I might have gotten killed. And we went through those, and using the EMDR allowed me to process those moments, and then for me to understand fully, completely that I was safe. And so those memories of when I thought I was going to be killed are now properly filed memories in my brain, in my head, in my hippocampus, wherever you want to refer to it.
Yeah.
I don't have that fear anymore. It's really quite remarkable.
I don't think unless the technique's changed, you sit in a chair basically next to the other person, but one chair's facing one wall, one chair's facing the wall behind you. And my therapist, she had her hand in front of my face. She had two fingers, and she was just like literally just waving her hand in front of my eyes. And she just asked me to follow her fingers with my eyes while we talked. And there's some wild stuff that our brains do because of our eye movement.
So people, here's the funny thing, Osher, but people don't know why it works. They actually still don't know why it works. But here's what it does. Here's what it does. When the therapist's fingers move in front of your eyes, what that does is it puts enough, a little bit of stress, a little bit of strain on your working memory so that your amygdala doesn't go bananas when you relive that event, when you talk about that event, okay? So you're following, and actually the therapist's fingers move faster than you think. So I remember when I'm thinking, geez, she's moving her fingers fast.
I remember that. Now I haven't talked about it since it happened, but I remember that.
And I'm having to follow these bloody fingers and then talk about this event where I thought this US soldier was going to shoot me, right? Yeah. And then I'm describing what happened, and then my psychologist is saying, okay, what sort of situation was this like? And I said it was the sort of thing that could happen to any journalist. It was a close call. And then she says, okay, it was a close call. So look at my fingers and lock that in. And so I'm saying to myself, to her, okay, it was a close call. And then we got to the safe part. You're safe now. Fingers again, lock that in. And after I did that, she said, now try to recall that image. And I'm thinking, why would I want to do it? I've been trying to forget that damn image. Yeah. But then when I did try to recall it, it was less clear. It was gone, was this high resolution image of 10 minutes ago. It honestly was less clear. It was like it had already been filed into my filing cabinet of my mind. I couldn't believe it.
It wasn't going through your immediate kind of it's called a fusion response, essentially, where you're reliving the physical.
I wasn't reliving it.
And that's amazing.
And on a scale of, my whole breathing had slowed, and it was just, and I was a bit skeptical that this would work for me, right? But it did. And then 2 weeks later, we did another scenario where I thought I might get shot as well. Yeah, worked again.
That's extraordinary. That is a lovely interaction with a mental health worker. Though you've been to the top of the mountain, mate. You've been on a psych ward.
I've really looked, and this is the other thing I think, Osher, is that it is hard out there to find people who can help you, right, or guide you. And especially now, and I feel I've been lucky. I mean, I got lucky in the psych ward. 2016, I was put with a psychiatrist, born in Iran, knew my world, understood my world, and wanted to take this journey with me.
Yeah, wow.
How lucky can you get? I've also fired psychologists, basically.
Oh, mate, me too.
That don't work for me.
That's funny.
So I think the important message is there for people, you got to find the person that works for you and keep looking until you do, because in some cases it might be a lifelong relationship that you have.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And life-saving, potentially.
Oh, my God. Someone asked me about that the other day. So what's the greatest investment you've ever made? I'm like, every single dollar I spent on mental health treatment.
Yep. No, no regrets.
There was a point when I was so crazy that I was like, take everything, all of my super, everything. I don't want one material thing. Take everything just so I don't feel like this.
Yeah.
And I couldn't. It was, money, nothing mattered. Nothing mattered. We're here talking, and it's 2023, and you've written a book, and you are comfortable saying, yes, I've spent time in a psych ward. I've spent time in a psychiatric facility. This would, who's ever going to get fucking employed saying that out loud when I started my career?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
That we're in a situation now, that we're in a work environment now where it's kind of seen as, oh, no, it's like ICU, but for your brain. And they're better now. For people who, have maybe are wondering, what's it like in a psych ward?
It's a great question, and it depends.
Yeah.
Which I know people hate that answer. It depends. But it
Well,
really
obviously depends on where you are. Like, there's some 5-star ones here which are amazing, and there's the kind of ones that I used to go to as an outpatient in Brisbane, which smell like BO and cigarettes.
You've
got great doctors.
You've got the crisis psych wards in public hospitals, which are not great, right? But that's what they're there for when people are in crisis. Yeah. So the psych ward I was at, Ward 17, Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital in Melbourne, run by Austin Health, is, I think, one of the best PTSD facilities in the world. And I say that because I've spoken to people who have been treated in other specialist PTSD facilities around the world. You got 20 patients, 20 beds, private rooms, absolutely quiet. You could hear a pin drop. So you go in there, right, with PTSD, you are in a very peaceful, quiet environment.
Yeah.
You've got psychiatrists who understand trauma. You've got psychologists. You've got social workers, spiritual care workers, dietitians. Next door, you've got a veterans complex with a hydrotherapy pool. And you've got fellow PTSD survivors in there from all walks of life. Veterans, coppers, ambos. I met a chef, a teacher, a truck driver when I was in there. Who and everyone shares their stories. You're all in it together. It doesn't matter what you
Hang
did.
on a sec. Come on in. Come on in. Sorry, we're getting a visit.
That's all right.
Are you coming in?
Just wants a huggle.
That's all right. Come and say hey.
Quick huggle.
Come on in, mate. Come on in. This is Dean. He's in Tasmania.
I'm in Tasmania. Do you know where Tasmania is?
Yeah.
Have you got an ostrich on your shirt?
Oh. Think again. What's another long-necked bird?
Starts with E.
We go to the jungle, and there was one big emu.
Wow.
And we feeded it.
Did you? Oh, that's
fed it.
fantastic.
I'm going to have to go, buddy, because I've got to keep talking with Dean here.
Dad, I have to tell Dean something.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. What do you got?
And
Don't forget.
it'll be
Write it down.
4.
Write it
No
down.
way.
He's a journalist. He won't forget those facts.
I've already written it down.
Okay, say goodbye.
And I'm gonna be bigger than you.
Oh, okay.
Say goodbye.
Love you. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
to me.
Huggle, sorry.
That's totally fine.
Can I bring this?
It's yours, buddy. Thank you.
Oh,
Bye.
dearie.
Thanks for visiting. Bye. That's Audrey too. They're only going to be small and cute ones. And dude, come on in, have a chat.
Oh, yeah.
Every time.
No, totally.
That's a big part. I'd like to go back and talk about what was going on in the ward and what it was like seeing other people and being. I want to talk about that, but a big part of being sick, and we spoke about this at the beginning. A big part of being sick and being in that space, your brain tricks you into believing it's never going to be different, and that it's nothing. That life won't go on. And I remember my Dr. Chung would tell me, he goes, mate, life goes on. And he was like, he may as well have been explaining how the 7 dwarves, work in some sort of mining cooperative. And you know what I mean? Like, it's like, mate, it's fairy tales. Like, it's important to go, yeah, this is fucking terrible. This is so fucking shit.
Yeah.
But in 10 years from now, like, and it was 10 years ago, like, here I am. I've got, I'm married, there's kids.
Yep.
And it's important but when my brain was sick, I couldn't believe it.
Oh, yeah, totally, Osher. And the reason I went to the psych ward the first time was because I was suicidal.
Oh,
right.
Man. Yeah. I'm glad you went.
And I remember saying to Mary, my wife, when I actually told her I was feeling suicidal, and that was a good thing.
Smart.
Obviously.
Smart man.
Yep. And she said, you need to be hospitalized in a psych ward and soon. And I said, but what will the kids think about me going to a psych ward? See, it's this stigma, right? Yeah. This is 2016. And I was lucky. My best mate had flown down from Singapore. We're in Tasmania. He'd flown down from Singapore to support me. He'd been here for a couple of weeks. And he said, mate, it will help them if they see you getting treatment.
He's not wrong.
And it obviously did help them.
Yeah.
And the next day and the day after that, I didn't just all of a sudden feel better, of course, but I just felt, knowing that I was going to the psych ward, I just felt a bit of a foundation underneath me that it sort of stopped the plunge that I was on, because I thought, at least I go to this psych ward and I might get some answers, because I had no idea what was happening to me. I had no idea. And I thought I might get some answers. And my brain was just so confused and muddled. And it was an amazing experience. I learned so much there. The staff were amazing. So it was not a lockdown facility. You could sign out, you go for a walk, whatever.
Yeah.
You go out
There's
for
very
4
few
hours.
of them. There's very few lockdown facilities. So you don't.
Yeah.
People who are forensically needing to be in those kind of hospitals is a couple hundred at best in a population of 25 million. That's pretty amazing.
And I just think it's something that I talk about very openly and frequently, because I think it's something that people should use that opportunity to go if they can. And here's the problem, right? For a lot of private psych wards, you need private friggin' health insurance. And that is where it becomes a problem for more than half the population.
Yeah. When you're in there, and you mentioned you're in there with fireys and coppers and truck driver, teacher. Part of, and I know this, I'm wondering if it's the same in the recovery community. I've seen people come in and be like, yeah, I'm sitting here. What the fuck? You guys don't know. You don't know what it's like. And you've seen what you've seen. You've had happen to you what's happened to you. You've been through what you've been through. You've lost people. And you're sitting there with, I'm going to make up an occupation. Let's say there's a baker in there. You're like, what could you fucking want? How could you be? No, you don't know how fucking sick I am. At what point, and I'm wondering if this has happened, did you start to hear some similarities and go, all right, this is what brains do when we get severely traumatized? Did you start to hear similarities? Did it take a little while?
First group session.
Yeah, right.
Seriously, first group session, because the topic was noise and arousal, right? And there was about 9 guys in the room, veterans and coppers, and they're talking about the things that set them off: loud shopping centres, train stations, kids, and all the things that just send them crazy. And I'm thinking, geez, that's me. I'm thinking, wow. I'm sitting there and I'm going, these guys are just like me. Got Vietnam veterans in there, veterans of the war in Afghanistan. There was a guy there who'd been a peacekeeper in Somalia, in bloody Mogadishu. And then after we went through all of that sort of stuff, one of the guys said that for his wife, it was like at home, it was like walking on eggshells. And that was exactly what it was like at home for my family, with me. Everyone felt like they were walking on eggshells. And I'm just thinking, I can't believe it. This is just... So it didn't matter whether you were journalist, copper, veteran, truck driver. Everyone was exhibiting very similar symptoms, had the same sort of symptoms. We could all learn from each other.
And on the topic of learning, on the idea of learning, it can be overwhelming. Like, I'm this sick, I can't be with my family. I'm so sick, I can't see my children or my wife or my friends. I'm in a fucking psych ward. I'm this bad. I've been suicidal. Like, that can be overwhelming.
Sure.
You write about finding a path through that by approaching this instead, reframing it and looking at it with curiosity.
Yep.
Can you talk about what does being curious about a situation is as frightening as this? What does that do for you?
And look, it didn't happen overnight. All right, this idea of being curious. I mean, I thought I'd go into the psych ward the first time and come out cured. I thought I'd come out a new man. Mm-hmm. And as I write, my psychiatrist had to break it to me. Dean, you're in crisis. This is the first stage. This is an introduction to treatment, as she put it. And I was like, it was like she'd hit me with a ton of bricks when she said that. But over time, I found that if I was to look at a situation where especially if I'd had, say, a panic attack, or if something had really set me off, to look back at that with curiosity and say, why did I respond like that? Why did I get really agitated? What was it that did it? And this is when I started to try to understand how the brain works and how the brain responds to trauma. And this is how I then started to get into the polyvagal theory and these sorts of things. And once I started understanding how the bloody brain works and got curious about that, I could see how my body was reacting and how all of this trauma that I'd absorbed and so on was now getting repeated, if you like, in the everyday life at home, and how, okay, you might not be able to stop the everyday life at home, but you can at least you know how to respond to that. Yeah. And I found that approaching it with curiosity as opposed to approaching it with doom and gloom, oh my God, this is never going to go away. But with that a curious approach, it took a lot of the sting out of the reactions that I was having.
Yeah. Imagine for a second that you don't know what sunburn is. All right.
Yeah.
And you go on holidays to the Gold Coast. All right. And suddenly, after I love it. I'm in the water. I'm in the sun. I'm on the sand. I'm building sandcastles. This is brilliant. And that night, while you're eating your takeaway pizza or your fish and chips or whatever, you start to blister and you have no idea what it is. You'll be fucking terrified.
Yes.
But you know what it is. You're like, your body's having this tremendous reaction. It's so bad, your skin will peel off your body. But you're like, it's painful.
Yeah.
Fuck, it hurts. I know why.
Yeah.
Okay. I know what to do next time. If we don't know what is going on, it can be over fucking whelming.
Yeah.
First time I had an anxiety attack, I called the ambulance because I thought I was dying.
There you go.
All right. I was 18. I was just high.
You probably got an earful from the ambos, did you?
It's true. No, they were actually quite low. But it is in that education. It is that figuring things out and understanding, what does an amygdala hijack feel like, and having that self-awareness. It's very hard to be self-aware, particularly if it grabs you before you have a chance to look at it.
Sure.
What are some things that you look out for? For me, I look for the feeling of my body changing. I look for the flood. I look for the feeling of the flood. I look for, it's kind of like a tingle in the back of my jaw.
Yeah.
And, around the back of my eyes when I get that adrenaline spike. That's when I know, like, I probably shouldn't say whatever comes up. Might just breathe a bit.
Yep. Yeah. For me, it's always tightness in the chest. Just that's always been an absolute message to me that I'm not traveling so well if I start to get a bit tight in the chest, or if my breathing gets a bit shallow.
Yeah.
Always a sign. I think going back to that education and awareness, and here's what I say to folks, and I stress to people, you got to be curious, and you got to educate yourself, which means you got to read. You can't watch TikTok videos about this shit.
No,
right? I hate to break it to people, but you've got to read about this stuff. And one of the only criticisms I had of Ward 17 was that all they had on the bookshelves were airport novels, and the reasoning was, we don't want to trigger people with stuff on trauma, PTSD, war, or whatever. And I'm saying, people,
mate, the fucking crockery was triggering me at one point.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
I'm not even joking. The fucking crockery was triggering me. It doesn't matter.
Exactly, but and look, I mean, I know people consume reading material in different ways. So whether it's audiobooks or ebooks or whatever, but people need to educate themselves about trauma, mental illness, and how to deal with it, so that they can. You can't have that awareness until you have that education, I don't think.
Yeah.
So it's important.
I'm guessing there was a bit of a swagger in your step when you were, starting your work in Jakarta, and then when you were, rolling around the world being the journo.
No, the New York Times journalists were the ones with the swagger.
Oh, I'll bet.
Or CNN.
Having kids changes you. What's happened to you has changed you. How do you look at the world differently now? You might have, wanted to get up and chase the danger for a while, which is fine. It's what young men do. How's it changed for you now?
Gosh, no one's really asked me that question, Osher. I tell you what's changed is I just see, I do see a lot of the injustice and suffering in the world now. I feel it. I can't watch the news much.
Yeah.
Find it very hard to watch the news. I sometimes want to get involved in things that are just going to take me down a rabbit hole that I don't have the bandwidth for. And I get very upset about, things like transparency and government accountability, and I worry about the future of the planet.
Yeah, mate, fuck you and me both. But these are both things, these are all things that are, we spoke earlier about moral injury and the betrayal of, a position of authority. Like, ultimately, I'm fucking powerless when it comes to, I can't change what my government does. Yet there's things that I can do in my day that make me feel a little better about it. What are ways that you go through your day that allow you to feel like, well, I've taken a little bit of action in some way?
I think, this book is the culmination of that. In a way, it's taken 7 years to get this done. When 7 years ago, when Mary was suggesting I write a book, I'm saying, people don't want to read another book by another old journo. But then during my first psych ward admission, I thought, yes, I can actually make a contribution here.
Yeah,
because there's a lot of people out there who are struggling and suffering with trauma, but who can't tell their story, and I can tell my story, and in a way, be their voice, and at the same time help others. So I think for me, this is possibly one of the most important things I've ever done, is this book. And I feel that the amount of time it's taken has actually been a good thing.
Yeah.
I really thought that it would be out years ago. And this has nothing to do with trying to find an agent, trying to find a publisher. I think that the amount of time it's taken has helped a lot of these ideas and thoughts crystallize and just, sometimes you need time to reflect, don't you? You know what I'm talking about, because you've done a second edition of your book, which very few people get the opportunity to do.
Well and truly. Look, I'm very interested in the space that you are in, and I think what you're doing and what you've done, and particularly the lens through with your superpower is that people are very familiar with the moment that you're talking about, the footage we spoke of earlier, and that therein is a lens to otherwise speak to and have the attention of people who otherwise would never, ever consider the kind of things you're talking about. So that's quite the superpower. What would you hope people would like to know about those that we care about, those we love, those we yet to know who have PTSD? Or what would you like people to know about that?
Actually, I think one of my main messages is the bloody workplace. There is so much trauma in the workplace that is unaddressed, untreated, because so many people are afraid to put their hand up and disclose the fact that they are suffering, whether it's PTSD, moral injury, or some other mental health issue, because they're afraid of losing their job, being seen as weak, missing out on a promotion, or whatever the reason might be. And I think, the mental health conversation in Australia has come a long way in 20 years as a society in general. We sit around and talk about mental health all the time. The campaigns are completely normalized. No one bats an eyelid if a Beyond Blue poster gets put out or someone's campaigning for Black Dog Institute. It is just, it's part of our national conversation now, but it's not in the workplace, because there's a lot of lip service and there's a lot of box ticking, but until staff in all organizations feel comfortable putting their hand up and saying to their boss, I need help, we haven't reached the point we should be at. And I think that's what I really want to push for. Get to that point.
And I agree with you. And when I talk about this, and when I go and do keynotes and stuff, I often say, look, I have the career I have because of the brain that I've got.
Yeah.
All right. I'm lucky because I know that I'm a high value employee, and in my industry, I'm not alone with this kind of brain.
Yeah,
we can gravitate. People with my particular kind of dip switches tend to kind of find their ways to these corners of the world. But we're in a world where we need more ideas than ever, right? And making sure that people feel safe enough and are in a healthy enough place to bring all their ideas to work is important, because ultimately it's an economic advantage.
Yeah,
if everyone is doing their best,
they
really are.
Everyone benefits.
Everyone benefits. And it's, just like putting a safety railing,
on psychological
the
guardrails are the same as safety rails on a factory floor.
There you are. And there it is. I love you, man. You're amazing. If there's anything I can do for you, Dean, don't hesitate to ask, buddy. But thank you so much for writing the book, and thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
No, absolute pleasure, Osher. Thank you.